Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Emily McCrary Ruiz Esparza. I'm an independent journalist who covers business, work, the labor market, and women in the workplace. I write for outlets like The Economist, the BBC, Quartz, Business Insider, Fast Company, and Digiday's Work Life. This webinar is brought to you by Attuned, the AI-driven platform that measures intrinsic motivation and psychological safety. I'll tell you a little bit more about them. Attune shows companies what really matters to their employees by making visible the psychological data that exists around and between people. This allows busy managers to get to know their teams quicker and communicate more effectively, which in turn reduces employee turnover, drives engagement, productivity, and innovation, increases psychological safety, and ultimately builds happier, more successful organizations. In today's webinar, we'll be discussing how employers can create equitable workplaces when DEI isn't an option. Globally, turnover for chief diversity officers is high, and many employers have pulled funding for various DEI programs, while some are laying off their DEI teams altogether. Around the world, programs and initiatives labeled DEI or DEIB are in question. In an article published this month, Belle Wilkins and Allison Taylor of the NYU Stern School of Business wrote, "The debate over DEI has turned into a conflict between those who question the idea's very premise and those who view any critique of current approaches as an attack on that premise. Critics and supporters alike seem to flatten its complexities to serve their agendas, and supporters deploy it as a platform for untenable censorship, and detractors make it a scapegoat for everything they find wrong in academia, politics, and business," end quote. In other words, it's really complicated and it's something people get really heated about, but mostly because they care about it very deeply. But might these broad moves to squash anything labeled DEI actually mark a turning point for equity in the workplace? How can employers create environments that motivate workers to behave equitably and inclusively without a formal program labeled DEI? How can leaders handle these tense conversations and speak to change-resistant employees? Today, I'm joined by a wonderful panel. I'd like to welcome Katina Sawyer. She's an associate professor of management and organizations, University of Arizona. Shane Lloyd, the chief diversity officer at Baker Tilly. Kristen Parisi, a reporter for Morning Brew covering diversity, equity, inclusion, and Jackie Steele, founder and CEO of Enjoy Japan. Keep in mind, to our audience members, we're happy to take questions for our panelists throughout the conversation. We'll also reserve some time at the end, so feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen or in the chat. We'll get to as many as possible as they come up. And we're happy to field those. So I'd like for each of our panelists to tell us a little bit more about what they do with their work. We will start with Jackie Steele, who's joining us from Vancouver, Canada.
Great. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon for those joining from wherever your place is in the world. It's lovely to be here, and thank you to Attuned for bringing us all together for this really critical conversation. I'm a law and political science professor by training, and I've spent much of my life in academia and also in practitioner spaces working on, I guess, what we now call DEI, but I guess in the olden days, we just called it, democratic equality or human rights, or we called it advocacy for, intersectional inclusion of women. And so in Canada and my place for over about maybe 15, 20 years in Japan, I've been looking at these issues and trying to figure out through cross-national research, how do we execute a diverse citizenship model and then mainstream that into all of our public policies, the way our political representation in parliaments is diversified, and through to the grassroots of policies and programs execution, how our corporate boards are diversified, how our companies are diversified, and how we really give equal opportunity and create a thriving and dynamic society and economy. Predominantly, I've been looking at G7 countries. But yeah, that sort of work has been the base for 25 years, and I've pivoted that into now DEI consulting for over the last 4 years as CEO of Enjoy Japan, working predominantly with Japanese leaders and Asia Pacific leaders, and also with a new base in Vancouver for Enjoy Innovation as well.
Happy to have you. Shane Lloyd, who's joining us from London.
Hello, everyone. Typically, I'm in the United States, but I'm actually in London for a global D&I forum, so serendipitous timing. How I like to describe my job is in 3 senses. My first and primary job is to ensure that regardless of what level you are in the organization, whether you're an entry-level professional or an executive, you understand what you're supposed to do to help drive equitable and inclusive outcomes within our organization. So for our executive leaders, we need them to take a 30,000-foot view and inspect the organization for inequities and anomalies, and then use their power to course correct. For our entry-level professionals, we want them to be self-aware, develop an inclusive mindset, and learn how to contribute to an inclusive team. So that's number one. The next part is working with our business leaders to ensure that DEI as a framework is embedded into how we do our business, such that it's not bolted on, but really thoroughly and meaningfully integrated to our operational culture. And then the last part is making sure that there's a DEI framework, like our entry level to executives, a DEI framework that's applied to every element of our talent lifecycle, from sourcing to recruiting to onboarding, learning and development, succession planning, even how we look at benefits, compensation, but also investigations. Are we disparately or disproportionately scrutinizing some over others? Are we holding people more accountable to our policies and practices compared to others? All of that work is my day-to-day.
Happy to have you, Shane. Shane and I've gotten to speak before for articles in the past, and I always learn something from Shane. So I'm really happy that you're here. Kristen, who's joining us from the Alexandria, Washington, D.C. area. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I am a DEI workplace reporter at Morning Brew. I've been only in this space for about 2 years now, covering DEI, but I think what kickstarted this all for me was about 10 years ago. I wrote my first story on a DE&I, but through a disability lens. I use a wheelchair, and at the time, disability wasn't really talked about as a part of DEI programs. So that's kind of what, I guess, kickstarted my passion for this space. And then I've just had the absolute privilege to get to talk to people who are a lot smarter than I am every day and get to report on it for our readers.
Happy to have you, Kristen. And last but not least, Katina, who's joining us from Arizona.
Yes. Hi, everyone. So I am an associate professor of management and organizations at Eller at the University of Arizona. And my work has both an academic and a practical application. I have a PhD in gender and women's studies and in industrial organizational psychology. So I try to combine psychology and sort of these like structural ways that we understand inequities to look at how workplaces might create more diverse, equitable, and inclusive environments. And I've been researching those topics for over a decade, but I also teach MBA students and undergrad students around issues of DEI for a similar length of time. In addition to that, I have LLC'd a long time ago and started doing DEI consulting in organizations, but more recently have started working with a friend who's a practitioner in the people analytics space. And we formed a company called Worker Being, and together we, under the workplace wellness umbrella, address issues of DEI along with issues of burnout, exhaustion, and general toxic workplace environments. So that's sort of my background and what I'm bringing to the table today.
Okay, I feel super spoiled by the CVs of everybody here. This is going to be a really excellent conversation. So let's begin here. Shane, I'm going to throw this question to you first. Why have DEI programs and anything under that name? Sometimes it's called DEIB, sometimes it's called D&I, whatever you want to call it. Why are those programs being called into question? And taken in good faith, what are the current arguments for slashing anything under that moniker?
That's an excellent question. And I actually want to acknowledge that in the structuring of this panel, we're doing exactly what we need to be doing for the broader society. And by that, I mean bringing some of the best and brightest minds to tackle this issue across industries. So I'm really honored to be here. So I wanted to start off with that to start. To tackle, well, first, why is everything being lumped together? Because when people are attacking DEI, they're talking about programs that are designed for historical redress. So affirmative action programs. They're also talking about sponsorship and mentorship programs. They're talking about affinity groups or business resource groups. They're even talking about scholarship programs. It's almost as if it's become a kitchen sink. And I think part of that is actually due to systemic miseducation around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Said another way, if understanding around the goals, purposes, and definitions of diversity, equity, inclusion were as consistent as A, B, and C, we would actually not be in a place of this much argument and misinformation. So I'll say that. And oftentimes, many of the either civil rights, if you take the United States, either civil rights or compliance activities have an outsized picture in people's minds, but that actually isn't fully reflective of the evolutions and shifts and the various phases of diversity, equity, inclusion, both as a function and a profession, and even the evolutionary shifts. So when people flatten this complex set of work that has actually evolved across time, you can see people kind of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. So that goes to your first question around why everything's being lumped together. People actually genuinely do not know the difference between much of anything sometimes. So it's up to us to help really offer some precision and frame that precision not as being nitpicky, but really helping people understand materially how functions have evolved and developed. So just like our businesses, regulatory circumstances change, laws change, cultural dynamics change, and then we need to shift accordingly. To your second question, when we actually take the arguments in good faith, they boil down to a few, I'll say some of the arguments, and then I'll also say some of the underlying assumptions. So from an arguments perspective, there's this idea that we are taking away from the people who are either well represented or have historically been represented in an organization to create opportunities for others. So underneath that assumption is a zero from some framework. We're not expanding the pie, we're just taking away and giving to others. The other part is that our work is too narrowly focused on women and people of color, and that is inherently discriminatory in and of itself. And which I would also say is a misunderstanding of the nature of discrimination. There's a very big difference between invidious discrimination. I discriminate against you because I deem you inferior, whereas I'm superior, and simply targeting folks because of the accumulated and long tail of addressing historical inequity, which is a very different circumstance. And then the third argument is it's already a meritocracy. Why do we actually have to engineer outcomes if the world is fine? And I remember I actually did a training with a global audience, and I actually asked them, I said, okay, what was the first year that a woman entered the accounting profession in your country? And one of the most striking themes is that across the world, most women entered the accounting profession in the late 1800s to the 1920s. And that wasn't because women were warmly embraced. It was because of the passing of anti-discrimination legislation that prevented further discrimination of women. So I think that's an important context, because I think that when people see gains for different groups today, they actually do not remember how hard it was to win those opportunities.
In my mother's lifetime, women were not able to own a credit card in their own name. So I think in the United States, I think that's important to remember. When she was an adult, this was happening. So yeah, I think you're right. It's really easy to forget that some of these things come about because of very specific codified changes or very deliberate work. Kristen.
Yeah, I think maybe this is unfair of me, but I think a lot of the arguments that we are hearing against DEI and the push to completely eliminate them is actually not that much in good faith. So much of it is coming from extreme ideological standpoints, and this idea that it's not a meritocracy, that folks have that people of color, that disabled people, that members of the LGBTQ+ community are only in their positions because of their identity, not because of what they've done and the work that's gone into it. So I think that's a huge part of it. And I think that we can't ignore that that's where so much of this legislation, we're coming into election season. There's 18 pieces of legislation that are up for consideration right now across the country that would ban DEI programs in colleges, which are direct feeds into corporate America. So dismantling DEI systems in colleges will have, from what I'm hearing, will have an impact on even what corporate America looks like moving forward. Now, on the flip side, I think there is some argument to say, not like let's remove DEI programs, but But how effective are they in actuality? They're nothing new. Folks make it seem like, a lot of folks say, well, they're new since 2020. They're not. A lot of folks who are performative about it have implemented programs since 2020, but they've existed since the 1960s. So, is your program effective? If it's not, what can you do to change it to make it effective? And I think that's where some very legitimate questions are coming from of, okay, well, we've dumped all of this money into these programs, but we still see very high attrition on working mothers. Well, great. Like, what are we doing wrong that we're failing our working mothers? And that doesn't come back to, well, DEI programs just shouldn't exist. It's okay, well, what systems do we still have in place that are preventing our underrepresented communities from thriving?
Jackie, what would you add?
I'm going to put on my political scientist hat and law reform sort of perspective to say, democratization and pathways to democratization are unfolding around the world in democracies globally, and they all have a different pace and rhythm. And simply because the democracy isn't working doesn't mean you decide that you're just going to flip into be an authoritarian state. And let's just give up on democratic rights and freedoms altogether because it's not working, and let's tear it all down. It takes time. It is an obligation of all political leaders and all corporate leaders and all societal leaders to be building the project of democratic rights and freedom and liberty and happiness for the population. And so I think getting into the sort of zero-sum divisiveness that we see unfolding is fundamentally at odds with all of the democratic constitutions on record that are saying, hello, people, we all have a shared and co-creative responsibility ethically, democratically, legally, as our highest supreme law in the constitutions are telling us. This is the work. Let's do the work and let's do it better. Yes, sure. Let's debate about it. Let's continue to have a competition of ideas around how we do it better. But simply repealing things that are, to other panelists' perspectives, hard won. It's taken 200 years to get some of these rights to be even on record legally in our constitutions and protecting us. And so the fact that we're seeing democratically elected governments turn against these democratic rights and freedoms is kind of shocking from my perspective. We look to the United States, and the United States purports to be in this position of, a democratic leader within the G7 and within the G20, and thinking about having a fair economy. And a free and fair economy includes equity. And so those are non-negotiables that I don't think we're stepping back and taking the big picture, that this is not about a narrow corporate DEI conversation. DEI did not invent the concept of equity. It's a legal, framework of analysis that we have been fighting for through social movements and civil rights movements and disability rights movements and queer movements and LGBTQ inclusion. Neurodiversity inclusion. The list goes on of what social movements have been working towards with democratically elected leaders and corporate leaders. And corporate leaders have a role to play in saying, not in my backyard. Public policy does its piece to set the ecosystem of what we take to be baseline equality and freedom and rights. Corporations need to clean house and make sure they're building it in their ecosystems. And that is the moral imperative or ethical. And frankly, from my perspective, if I put back on my CEO hat, we say that, diversity and equity are drivers of innovation. So for us, the I is innovation. The DEI is the innovation piece. And if we want a sustainable and equitable innovation in a vibrant economic society where there is happiness and thriving for diverse populations, diversity and equity are non-negotiables. And we know this as a democracy, I would believe, but we're losing track of the big North Star of what we're building in terms of equitable socioeconomic cooperation across very diverse populations.
The fact that all of these different programs, even ideas, are being called into question. Katina, what do you think this means for people who really care deeply about diversity, equity, inclusion, and seeing workplaces be healthier?
Yeah, I think it means that we just have to get a little creative. And it depends on the extent to which things are mandated or being actively dismantled. And what's the actual mandate? Are we not allowed to use certain words? Are certain programs going to get flagged? The idea is that you're doing the work, and the work doesn't necessarily have to change because the words change. I think sometimes people like us to fight about words because it distracts us from doing the work we're supposed to be doing, right? Like, I want to call it this, I want to call it, why can't I say this anymore, right? And I think words are very important, and I don't take words lightly, but I also don't want us to get so caught up in calling it something when we could be focused on what we're doing and what's at the core of what we're doing. So I think getting creative around what is it that, when we boil it down, these programs, systems, processes are doing, and how do we implement what those programs and processes are doing in a way that's going to keep us off the radar of being distracted from the work because of the words, right? And so it is hard to operate out of a structure that doesn't have like a clear word and frame. It's more difficult to implement, but I think some things that are encouraging, a lot of what people say that they want from leaders, marginalized population members who are asked, I did a large scale study looking at what do people in historically marginalized populations mean when they say their leaders inclusive, and what do they want from leaders, and how do they actually see their leaders implementing things that they want. And what they want is for their leaders to sit down and get to know them as people, to honor their struggles in the organization as real, to recognize that what they face in the organization may not necessarily be what the leader has faced in the organization. They may be living in different realities. They want the leader to help them build their confidence because they may have been overlooked for opportunities in the past. That means helping them understand their talents and skills, providing opportunities. And they also want a systemic look that systems are operating in a way that what people put in, they get out. And that if that hasn't been happening, that we find a way to get people on an even playing field before we start making people, before the system starts operating in what we would call like an equality framework, right? Where everybody gets the same thing. And so that's really what people want. So, okay, if that's what people want, how do we then frame that in a way that's going to help us get to that place with the path of least resistance, right? And so when I think about implementing some of these programs from a systemic perspective, for example, legally, it's actually super helpful for the organization to have very clear criteria for how they're selecting people, to get bias out of the process, to have very clear selection indicators that predict performance down the line. It's very helpful for people to give specific forms of feedback that are very objective, to be anchored when they're filling out those forms in a way that everybody interprets the feedback form the same way, and a 4 means a 4 for this manager means a 4 for this manager. These are all like scientific HR best practices, right? And so like all of those things result in greater rates of equity, more representation, et cetera. So is there a way that we can get to the outcome and sort of do an outcomes backwards look? Not that I want to just abdicate the words and you win, you can have them, right? Like, I don't know that always works, but at the same time, I also don't want us to be fighting about words and then all the work is just evaporating, right? So I think a balance there is important.
I want to remind our audience, I saw a couple people raising their hands in the audience. We're going to request that people submit their questions via the chat or the Q&A for this session. If you prefer to do that anonymously, you can, the Q&A option, Q&A function will allow you to do that anonymously if that's what you prefer. So we just ask that folks do that in the interest of time. I would like to pose an audience to the question, pose to the audience a question, which is this: are your DEI programs getting more or less attention or resources in your organization right now? Are you finding a direct impact of this in the work that you're doing? Shane and Jackie, I'd like to put this one to you. What advice do you have for employers who are worried about the resistance or even outright opposition on DEI? Maybe it's from employees, or maybe it's from stakeholders like board or major shareholders. Jackie, we'll go with you first.
Sure. I mean, I think speaking from what I'm seeing both in the Japanese context and the Canadian context, I think it's going to be quite different from what many of you are facing in the United States. In Japan, there was a rise in first-time hiring of DEI in-house leaders on the eve of Black Lives Matter. Honestly, that created a certain upswing in awareness whereby multinational companies with a large presence in Japan suddenly realized they weren't doing enough to make sure that their global DEI strategies were actually being trickled out and implemented and localized to the grassroots in Japan. So we had actually a big upsurge. And I think that we're still in that dynamic in Japan because the last 10 years of democratization in Japan has meant greater attention to gender equality, more structurally being seen as a democratic and economic issue for the first time, really, in the last 10 years, that it's an economic issue, crippling the Japanese economy. Also an upswing in LGBTQ inclusion and very much advocacy around same-sex rights and same-sex marriage. And so different challenges in the Japanese market that are quite unique. So we haven't had this backlash, I would say, in the same way. At the same time, what we bring to the table in terms of, in Japan, there is an attentiveness to being inclusive in terms of trying to aim at sameness of treatment, almost, in a way that undermines DEI to be rigorous, specifically designed, and nuanced to the actual existing legacy inequalities. So for Enjoy Japan's approach, we always bring an intersectional lens. We work across 15 diversity dimensions, and we build a universal design that is taking seriously 15 diversity dimensions that moves the conversation beyond, oh, this group is getting more and that group feels like they're getting left out, or this group thinks that they're getting a special program, but then the men are grumbling because the women are getting a leadership program. So to move beyond the divisive potentially appearance of some people getting a special treatment, we bring that sort of universal perspective that says this is a universal design that benefits everybody in the company. And the needs are diverse, and therefore the needs are tailored within the design of the program rollout to be addressing those 15 diversity dimensions, because they all work creatively to build an innovative competition of ideas and helping talent facing different barriers across the ecosystem, because the goal is to reduce the barriers, right? Across all those needs. And everybody can get behind that and agree on that. I think in a Canadian lens, our Charter of Rights and Freedoms in the Constitution is so clear on Section 15. Equality rights means a whole list of marginalized, historically marginalized, underrepresented groups for which Canada as a country has to soldier to make sure that we're solving those inequalities, those legacy systemic inequalities. Section 15(2) is even explicit in saying that this means that affirmative action policies, programs specifically targeting those legacy inequalities, are constitutional. It is not up for debate. So since 1982, that is our constitutional guarantee, and that's our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So this kind of backsliding would never be possible within the Canadian context. And so whether you call it DEI or whether you call it democratic equality rights or an equity lens, there's a very robust constitutional grounding to it that means we've solved that in 1982, and now it's just how do you execute to the grassroots? And I think most of the time it's our public policy frameworks at the federal, provincial, and municipal level are obliging all civil servants and even crown corporations and other extended large companies to say, you must do an intersectional diversity analysis, and you must use disaggregated data and be evidence-based and make sure you're solving your systemic inequalities under your purview of what you're stewarding within this work. And so being rigorous and evidence-based, data-driven is just an imperative, and our Statistics Canada is impeccable in collecting the data to support this kind of work to move forward.
Shane, what's your point of view? What advice do you have for employers who are worried about resistance or outright opposition?
So there are a few things that actually come to mind. I actually want to pull Dr. Steele's comments around universal design, because said another way, that's what's called the curb cut phenomena. So how do we design for the most vulnerable to the benefit of many, and then begin telling some of those stories? So if we think of curb cuts in the street, initially designed for people in wheelchairs, but also work for people who are pushing strollers, pushing baby carriages, and then also people with temporary injuries or people with bicycles. So how do we make some of those connections so people can see that we're aiming to lift all boats, even as we're trying to level the playing field and closing gaps? So that mindset, that philosophy of curb cut connected to that storytelling becomes particularly important. Next, I also think it's important to make the invisible visible. So oftentimes we might hear, well, why is there this special program or sponsorship program for women or people of color? Well, actually, the reason that these sponsorship programs exist is because there's actually a ton of very invisible, untracked, and unaccounted for mentoring that's happening in the people who are well represented in our organizations across levels. If people can throw a stone and find someone who went to the same school, similar background, the ease of bonding and connection is so simple that they never engage in the labor of bridging across difference. It's really hard to notice that that is happening. So we have to make the invisible visible so people can understand the context. And I offered even an example with, ask people, when I asked a bunch of accountants, when did a woman enter your profession? That was another example of making the invisible visible, because for many organizations, they've actually gotten 50-50 for a gender representation. But that is an incomplete story, something to celebrate, but incomplete. I also think it's important to segment audiences and help them understand, how does DEI benefit everyone? That inclusion for all really means inclusion for all and not just inclusion for some. And then I would also say too, that organizations need to develop backbone and courage, and not only be equipped with data, but also notice that when data doesn't work. And by that, I mean, there is an irrationality to systems of inequality. So when we say that data is a panacea, leaders can disregard data if it's unflattering. Leaders can disregard data if they don't like what it says. Leaders can actually disregard data if it's overwhelming to them emotionally. So how do we really think through, how do we scaffold in such a way that people can take difficult data and, rather than, turn a blind eye to it, really say, okay, how do we take an unflinching look to course correcting some of these challenges? Because the extent to which we do not, I'll put it this way, the extent to which we don't address some of the historical issues that we still have to address, the extent to which there are new challenges due to any number of geopolitical or global circumstances that are creating issues of belonging and inclusion for other groups, when these compound, the whole company is actually going to topple. If nobody feels like they belong, no one is being responsive and attentive, and no one's thinking about, to the best of our abilities and employers, what can we do to ensure that polarization in society doesn't just rip through our company cultures? And then the last thing I will say is, I think that Kristen said it beautifully. We have to actually sift between good faith and bad faith arguments. And one of the areas where I think that an Achilles heel has been revealed in many companies is many companies and their leaders are socialized, stay out of politics, stay out of politics, stay out of politics. How that then manifests is that many of our leaders are terrified of any politician attacking them, even if that's in bad faith. And if you do not develop the skill to challenge bad faith arguments, we're all going to be with our backs against the wall, with naturally deleterious consequences.
Thanks, Shane. Kristen, when we spoke before, and Jackie was talking earlier about the differences in what's going on in Canada and what she's seeing in Japan as well. When you and I spoke before, Kristen, you mentioned that DEI is getting a lot of attention in the US, but of course, this country is not the only place where DEI programs are going on, but also being challenged. What are you seeing going on in other countries? Maybe what's successful and what's unsuccessful?
Yeah, it's really interesting. This has been like a basis for a lot of my research recently. And looking at how different countries are handling things, there was an event I think it was this week, called, I believe, Inclusion Africa, because DEI as a concept and programming is really expanding greatly on the African continent right now. There's a lot with race equality happening. I was looking specifically at South Africa, where, there's a lot of programming that's geared towards racial equality, because that's still such a huge problem in South Africa. Looking at India, for example, their policies are obviously different. They struggle with keeping women in the workforce. Companies that I believe, don't quote me on this, but have more than 250 employees in India, they must have 2% of their workforce identify as disabled. Then, you move to Europe, they're a lot more progressive when it comes to gender pay transparency. That's been huge for places like Denmark in reducing that pay inequity that we've historically seen. Same thing with Australia. And so it's really interesting where, you know, we hear a lot in the US about this kind of DEI has gone like off the rails and gone too extreme, and, you know, the kind of woke corporate agenda. But when we look at what other countries are doing, it's actually not really, that's we're not doing anything extreme. And so corporations too need to look at what they're doing, you know, at their DEI programs, and see if those programs are global. Okay, well, what are they doing? I used to work for a company that had great pay leave or great parental leave in the UK, but their US employees did not have that. And so they saw their parents have to leave the workforce in the US, where in the UK, those employees were able to stay. And so it's really looking at things and saying, okay, well, how are our employees doing in China compared to how they're doing here? Well, why are they doing better there? Why are they thriving? Or why are they leaving there and we're able to keep our employees here? So I think if you're a multinational company, you cannot look at it through a US centric lens.
Mhm. Yeah, that's certainly something that I've encountered in talking to employers that I've reported on, where some will say, well, we just adhere to the country where the employee is located, and that's our standard. Others will say, we take the most detailed, we take the most requirements wherever we, you know, let's say it's, you know, Germany, that's, you know, of our population, they have the most, then we apply that to everyone and use that as the minimum, rather than the other way around. Jackie, really quickly, and then I want to get to an audience question.
Sure. Just to build on Kristen's observations, we did a study across Asia Pacific for one of our clients, one of the major tech companies, who wanted to do and understand all the diversity across six at least diversity dimensions across Asia Pacific. And Asia Pacific is, countries in Asia Pacific are some of the most diverse globally, and they are on a growth spurt, right, population wise, and in terms of managing diversity across their democracies. And so just absolutely, I think that to the extent that in the United States we can call on American leaders, the global leaders, political leaders, to decenter themselves as if this is the model, because the American way is not the model. And what we've been seeing is not actually the leadership we need to see globally in the geopolitical sense. And Asia Pacific is really, and what we now call Indo-Pacific, is really on the upsurge and tackling these issues and fighting the path of democratization in really interesting ways that are inspiring. And I think we all need to sort of decenter what G7 countries historically assume to be ahead of the game on these issues, and we're not always in that role. And certainly from a Canadian perspective, we're also working on decolonization in terms of harmonization and rebuilding with Indigenous peoples. We all have a lot of work to get done. And I think if we can just refocus and have some humility, that's also a part of being an intersectional diversity lens, is to decenter what we think to be the majority or the people who control the conversation from, you know, realizing their entitlement is showing and they need to take a step back and start listening.
Katina, I want to talk about some of your research, and then I hope you could address an audience question that I think you would be perfect for. My question to you is, why, in your experience in your research, why do people become defensive when matters of DEI are discussed? What have you seen?
Yeah, I think that there are sort of two things that happen here. The first is that when majority group members are trying to listen and learn from minority group members, historically marginalized populations, and they have a different experience than what those groups have, often they'll share that that's not my experience and push back on that. And that causes a lot of pain, right? Because the person's saying, this is my real lived experience and it's different from yours. And so there's a lot of emotion when people feel like their pains and struggles are being ignored or discounted. There's also on the other side, for even extremely well-intended people, right, a defensiveness around this idea that if I'm accepting that you've struggled, it means that I've had it easy the entire time, right? And everybody just thinks I've had no struggle. I've just zoomed to the top. People are just rolling out the red carpet for me. I don't have to work hard and things are just being handed to me, whatever. And so I think that this sort of lack of understanding pushes people further apart, where it's like, you don't see me at all on both sides, right? And I think that what happens when people have more human conversations, sit down and really connect with people and learn with others, is that they learn that they have more in common than they thought. And they're also more willing to understand that their experiences don't have to be the same, and that's okay. I have my students engage in lots of activities where they talk to their classmates about very in-depth issues that we normally wouldn't discuss in a work setting, right? But I see how quickly the tenor of the room changes when people start to really share their backgrounds. People start to be like surprised, like, oh, I had this assumption about this person and I'm learning something completely different about them, right? And so a lot of it, I think, is that we're talking past each other and we're not sitting down and having these human conversations. That being said, to Kristen and Shane's point, there are some bad faith actors, right, who are trying to harm people or discount what they want to say. But I don't like to spend, Dolly Chugg has a book called The Person You Mean to Be, which I really like. And that book basically says 10% of people are going to be these bad faith actors that are just trying to mess up everyone else's day. Don't spend your time worrying about those people. Spend your time on the 60% of people who want to get it right, but don't have the tools to do it. And so I think breaking down those defensive barriers is really crucial. And what I see it happening through is these like humanizing conversations where people take time to be seen and to really listen and learn from other people.
Very quickly, Katina's one audience member is asking about the name of a publication on leadership that you mentioned earlier. Do you remember what that was?
So this project that I'm working on is funded by the National Science Foundation. It is not published yet. I hope it will be published soon. It's in the academic review process right now. And so we have a shot to revise it and hopefully they'll like what we have coming out. But when it comes out, I can certainly let whoever know who wants to know. No problem.
You mentioned that the 10% or so of people who are sort of bad faith actors. There's a great book by the reporter Amanda Ripley called High Conflict, and I believe the term she uses is conflict entrepreneurs, where they're just there, like they kind of thrive on this, and sometimes literally people will make money off of it, but sometimes they're just there for the satisfaction. They love it. They feed off of it. I'm hoping you could address a question comment, Katina, from an audience member who presents this anonymously. They write, I've observed instances where DEIA practitioners swiftly indict individuals for their lack of understanding, inadvertently fostering socially accepted exclusion and tolerance within DEIA. This person has written a very, very long piece, and I think it's all very good. Could you react to that?
Yeah,
I'll say I've seen that personally.
Yeah, I agree. So I think that one of the when I think about DEI practice, I think about it similarly to a classroom as well, right? I use the same practices when I'm in organizations as I do in the classroom. And I think it's really about how you approach teaching. And if the purpose of teaching is that you think everybody's coming in with all the answers already, then why are we in the class? And so I think there needs to be some room for people. So many of my students and people who I deliver trainings to in workplaces say, I had a question, but I didn't want to ask it because I was afraid I wouldn't phrase it the right way. And so sometimes we can get in our own way by making this environment where it's like, if you're not perfect and you don't already know all the answers and you're not, and like, so I right away in every training that I do, share a story of a time I messed up. I made a mistake in a DEI space. I share a personal story about something that I still feel really horrible about. And I share it to say, like, this is what I teach. This is what I do. And I made this mistake. And it wasn't that long ago that I made that mistake. So if you're sitting here thinking, I'm not perfect at this, I make mistakes at this, I don't want to, of course, we need a professional boundary of like respectful conduct. And we set ground rules together usually of how we want to run the conversation. But I urge people to assume benevolent intent unless things get to a place of clear disrespect, right? And I also urge people to think about the fact that they've probably made missteps in this place. We all have. I saw somebody put in something about age. diversity is so layered. Like, there's no way in the world we are all experts on every identity that we live or don't live. And there's so much diversity within populations. So I think just approaching it as an instructor or a leader with some humility, like, I don't have all the answers either, but what we can commit to is trying to get a little bit better every day together. And that seems good to me.
Shane, what would you add?
I would add, we have to also think about audience and appropriate spaces and places and people. So I know one of the common mantras within social justice spaces is the oppressed shouldn't have to educate the oppressor. As someone who has a background in higher education, I think that, sure, if that is what you want to hold to at the individual level, there still needs to be some of us that are willing to provide and answer some of those questions. However, we also have to think about the space in which those questions are posed. If you're a leader posing that in an audience of 500 people, the question that you're going to leave people with is, how do you actually have the authority to lead this diverse company without ever having considered these experiences? Meanwhile, you have power over me. That's kind of painful. So how do we think of the places where people can get some of those messier questions answered? And I see that primarily as my responsibility as a chief diversity officer to get some of those questions answered. I remember someone asked me, is affirmative action, rather, is current day DEI affirmative action with lipstick? Is that how I would have phrased the question? Not necessarily, but I understood where they were going with the question and I provided an answer in a non-judgmental way. And that was very helpful because I personally like those kinds of questions to be able to untether some of the muddled information people might have in their heads and then offer some more clarity and insight. But oftentimes what people will do is, I'm going to find the person who holds an identity that I don't understand that's proximate to me, which is unfair because your colleague might just want to be an analyst or a physicist and they just happen to be any number of backgrounds. That doesn't necessarily mean they want to provide you that education. So how do we make sure we find some of those spaces and also take responsibility for our learning? And then I think the other part I would say too is, how do we help people see that they all have identities? So for example, oftentimes I take umbrage when people say, oh, gender issues or race issues. No, the issue is racism. The issue is sexism, the ways in which systems and behaviors create deferential negative impact because of how people identify. All of us should have the right to be, all of us should have dignity within our identities. But if there are systems that create differential outcomes, that's what we're throwing out, the systems. And I like to think of it like a spider web, in the sense that inequitable systems exist as a web. Some of us will get through, but the web shouldn't exist at all. And I think that that's what we all need to understand. If we can't see the web because we've gotten through, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We need to, once again, make the invisible visible so people can see, like, oh, this is how this is working. I see now.
Jackie, really quickly.
Yeah, I love both Katina and Shane's points. And I think what we see just from a Japanese context, conflict is not an option. Open conflict is just not done. In Japan, it seemed to be really immature in a professional space to be getting emotionally charged and angry and engaging in personal attack. It's just seen as unprofessional and like a lack of maturity, like you're having a little temper tantrum. And so it's really challenging to have conversations that provoke these kinds of feelings within a Japanese context that can address them head on. And so what's really been essential for our work over the last 4 years is calling everyone in to be a part of the solution, because that aligns with sort of the Japanese cultural expectation that you're going to have to wake up and go to work with that person tomorrow. So the divisiveness is just not happening, and it's not tolerable, and it's not tolerated. And you'll do yourself personally damage to be alienating and attacking, or be seen to be unable to regulate your own emotional response on how you're dealing with that. That causes problems in many ways. That I'm not saying that that's fair as an environment, but it means that being really careful to call in, never calling out, never provoking shame, because loss of face in a Japanese context and many Asian Pacific countries, that is the worst form of social excommunication, is to shame in front of other people and cause a loss of dignity for the individual just attempting to participate and learn and fail forward. And how do we hold space to fail forward gracefully together? Both in our classrooms, to Katina's point, in our teachings and our trainings, but also in society and in our corporate work. I think that is where we have a lot that we can be changing the conversation, that DEI within companies and building workplaces that are not toxic, means that we don't microaggress each other, even in the way that we're talking about these issues. And social justice movements and political movements are going to do that kind of very divisive call out tactics in a political game. That's where the space is. And I think that there's a space for that in democratic politics and where it's very antagonistic. I don't know that that makes sense in a workplace where we're humans and we need to be working together and seeing each other and protecting dignity for all individuals. And I sort of end up having to think back to how would I speak to my own children if they raise these questions, and how would I want someone to speak to them to answer those questions. And if we can think about that and think there's a little child in all of the adults in the workplace, how do we bring that person to understand, not in a paternalist way, in a respectful way, to say we're all failing forward gracefully together. Let's identify that we're all oppressors in different ways. And none of us doesn't have privilege. We all, on one of our intersectional 15 diversity dimensions, exercise oppression, disproportionate voice. And if we can't understand that and own that, we're missing the value of the intersectional lens.
As employers are having to contend with the fact that DEI is being questioned, a lot of them, specifically DEI leaders or folks who are in people operations, HR, even talent acquisition, are having to do some self-examination on their internal programs, what they're doing. Kristen, from your point of view, what are signs that a workplace has mishandled its DEI work? And what kind of recommendations do you have for course correcting?
I mean, I think the biggest indicator that maybe whatever DEI initiatives you have is if everybody looks the same and sounds the same. If I even think about this, I interviewed somebody a while ago that was when New York City passed its size discrimination laws. And, a lot of times you walk into a room and maybe a lot of folks look a little bit different, but they're all a size 4, they're all a size 6. Well, you don't even have diversity of size in your office. Well, what does that say? Are you really bringing in different thoughts? So I think just looking around you and understanding, do we have folks from different religions, different age groups? If your entire office is between the age of 25 and 32, you're probably doing something wrong. Every diversity of thought is so important. It's going to make your business better from when all of the research shows, but then also just examining what you're presenting out to the public, and then also what your practices are. So I think a lot about National Disability Employment Awareness Month. Every October, all corporations get geared up for it. They're posting online about how they support disability employment. But then these same companies have incredibly strict return to office mandates. And so employees are expected to be in the office 3 to 5 days a week. Well, that policy is excluding a huge potential population and excluding and potentially discriminating against your disabled employees. So if you don't have the policies that back up what you're putting out into the world, your efforts are probably not going to work out so well.
Mm-hmm. Kristen, I hope you could take this audience question because you report for HR Brew. Elizabeth asks, HR has been a particular point of struggle for us. Recommendations for helping HR work through their historical approaches / assumptions and move to a more progressive DEI perspective.
So it's interesting because sometimes DEI leaders funnel up into HR. Other times they funnel up into the CEO, and the HR leaders they're in a really tough spot. But I think what Shane said at the very beginning of this conversation is so important. If you bring a diversity, inclusion, equity mindset into your systems that you have across the board for HR, whether it's your recruitment policies, your onboarding policies, your upskilling programs, all of that, if inclusion, if equity, if all of that is part of those basic HR systems, then there's not going to be as much of a disconnect between, let's say, your head of DEI and your head of HR. You're more likely to be on the same page. From, Shane, I feel like Shane said it perfectly.
And do you mind if I add a quick thought? So I think the other aspect of it too is that organizations need empowered HR functions. And I've been seeing a lot of, when I see the news of, is DEI a failure, or the turnover rate of senior DEI leaders, I see the exit of a senior DEI leader as more of a judgment on the climate of the organization than it is a failure on the part of the DEI. There is no function in an organization, whether it's a business strategy, HR strategy, DEI strategy, ESG strategy, that is going to bear fruits in infertile ground. So organizations really need to think about, do we treat HR like the hired help and the invisible hands doing grunt work that leaders don't want to do or the business doesn't want to do? Or do we see this as a true value-added leadership function that helps the organization achieve its goals strategically? Any HR function that's seen as kind of like the hired help is going to yield inequitable outcomes for a whole host of reasons. So I think that's also important to consider as well.
Katina, what happens when employers walk back their commitments to DEI, whether in word or in action? What does that do to an organization?
Yeah, so I conducted a study with Todd Corley, who's the Chief Diversity Officer at Carhartt, and Vani Pamphile, who is a professor at George Washington University, where we interviewed Chief Diversity Officers pre and post George Floyd's murder. And actually, that was not part of our original study design, but we realized that we had an opportunity to really learn about what happens when a lot of attention is drawn to issues that people have been trying to sell in their organization for a period of time. And the research on issue selling suggests that when someone's been trying to sell an issue really hard and all of a sudden everyone pays attention to it, great things should happen. But we only found that happened in a small percentage of the folks that we talked to. And one of the reasons why that was the case was because people learned over time that their organization's actions were more performative than not. And so we have this story from a Chief Diversity Officer, a Black woman who was asked to get on a stage and tell her story about being a Black woman in America and talking to her son about getting pulled over, and this very emotional thing. And she thought, surely after I share this very emotional, raw thing that they've asked me to get up and share in front of the company, I'll get like more budget lines and there'll be more resources and the leaders will be more willing to show up to stuff. And they weren't. And she felt really exploited in that process. Like, wait, I was like up on stage, you filmed this, you like made this a thing that you were doing. And like my pain ended up being not valuable. And what does that tell me about my profession? And she got a lot of notes and letters from other Black people in the organization saying, this is really upsetting. Like, what can we do about this? Like, and so I think not just for the leaders many are very tired when they see commitments being walked back, because they're like, I thought this was the moment where we all got it. And now like, it seems like we're not getting it anymore. And if that doesn't do it, what does it? Right. And so I think people get exhausted and burn out, and worse, I think they start to think that this is just a fool's errand. Like there's no reason for me to do that. Not to end on a downer note though, but what I will say is we did have a subset of folks in our study who felt like their companies were more energized and vibrant as a result of people pitching in and wanting to pay more attention. And those institutions really invested money, resources, time, in a sustainable way, and in a way that they committed to showing up, not just putting up the resources, but showing up. And through the consistent provision of resources and showing up, it seems like they had a different outcome, both for the leaders themselves and across the workforce. So I think performativity is, you're not tricking anyone. People see it.
I lost my mute button for a second there, guys. Sorry about that. Any final words? We're just about out of time. I'll throw this to Jackie. If you could just in a few sentences, I know this will be a challenge. How can employers create an environment that motivates workers to behave equitably and inclusively? I know that's not possible to answer in a sentence, but how about one idea
And at the risk of, I'm not paid to say this, but honestly, Enjoy Japan partners with Attuned because we like to be an evidence-based company. We measure, and what gets measured gets done, right? We know this for companies. So we measure intrinsic motivation and the diversity across motivations for work in the employees. We like to measure the psychological safety. We measure their intersectional diversity through our own tools. And we put that into place to say, let's be evidence-based. These are the core ways where you can be strategic in moving a DEI business strategy and change management forward with these very specific, rationally tailored, very designed interventions that have high impact and that we know to have a high impact. Leaders need to then take the data seriously, have listening circles to understand the human elements, and show intelligent, emotionally intelligent leadership that says we're walking the talk, we're walking the walk, we have the data, we have the human stories, we have empathy, and we're going to put it into practice with budget and give it authority and give empowerment to our leaders across all parts of the business, rallying for us to move the dial on these measurements and then measure it again in 6 months and 12 months and 18 months and get it done. I mean, I think accountability, you need a good forcing mechanism, right? I think this matters.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists, Kristen, Katina, Shane, and Dr. Steele. Thank you so much for this. This webinar has been brought to you by Attuned, the AI-driven platform that measures intrinsic motivation and psychological safety. If you'd like to learn more about how Attuned can enhance communication within your organization, visit attuned.ai. And thank you so much to our audience for being so participatory. Great questions, great interaction. I'm just checking any final bits. If there were any follow-up questions, you're welcome to email me and I can help you get in contact with some of the panelists. EmilyMcCrary@gmail.com. You can Google me and find my email address pretty quickly. So if anyone has any follow-ups we weren't able to get to, you're welcome to contact me. Thank you guys so much, and everyone be well.